Welcome to the inaugural episode of the David Wells Experiment. So, why is it called that? Is it just so I can have a podcast with the letter E in the title, like the Joe Rogan Experience? No. So, the thing is, when I was a kid, my dad said, you're the experiment child. I used you to figure out how to parent. So, hence the David Wells Experiment. I figured it has a nice ring to it. So anyway, there's no real theme for this show. We'll talk about whatever I want to talk about. It's going to be random. You might notice some consistent things, but, it's anybody's guess how this is going to turn out. So anyway, I was just scrolling through Facebook, and the PS Vita store says no longer available for sale. For those who don't know, the PS Vita was Sony's handheld gaming console. I don't even know if Sony still does handheld gaming consoles. Anyway, that was their system, and now the online store doesn't work. So this is one of the problems I have with downloadable games and online interactivity. It's very difficult to maintain the legacy of a system. I think one of the benefits of retro games is you get a cartridge and it plays years later. Sometimes you have to keep it up, like you've got to replace the battery in a Game Boy cartridge so it can save. But it's still there. Now, with the introduction of online systems and downloadable games, there's a caveat. You can lose access to a game and potentially never be able to play it again. And this is why I think we need to have hard copies for games. Like, do we really want to make it where we're so dependent on the company to be able to play this game? Also, I don't like the idea of going to a subscription-based model. Although, in a business sense, I guess that makes sense. A business could make more money renting you a subscription than it could you decide to play one game, and you may or may not buy more. So I don't think that Nintendo has totally committed to this. So for once, their sort of dogged old conservatism in gaming and business has worked out for us. So I don't like mobile gaming, like games you play on your phone. But if there's one thing I think that they do right that more traditional video games could learn from is when I bought an app on the App Store way back when, I found that I was still able to download it. I don't know why video games, like the publishers, the major ones, why they don't make their stores. I don't know why they have to set up a new infrastructure every time there's a new system. You could say it has to do with the architecture of the varying systems. But I don't know why a smartphone, you can download an app that was first published 10 years ago. But with video games, the store that you buy, I don't know why Nintendo can't sell their DS games, their Wii games, and their Switch games all in the same store. Now you might say well, there's compatibility issues. True, but I know that, again, app stores have a similar conundrum. Some apps are not compatible with, say, iPads, so you're not able to download them. I mean, it feels that simple. Now, there is some bit of hope. PlayStation, they are creating an archival system for all their games, and it's about time. I can't believe it took them this long. For the longest time, archiving seemed to be the work and mission of nerds and enthusiasts to do this. Really think it's a shame that it took this long for like a company to do that. But I mean, on the one hand, they are a business and they've got to focus on pushing the latest software so that their current system can succeed. It is sort of a different beast from making films. But anyway, good on Sony for that. So recently, I heard that Yuji Naka, the creator of Sonic the Hedgehog, is suing Square Enix, the company most famous for publishing Final Fantasy. Now, what does this come down to? Basically, what happened was, back in 2018, Yuji Naka was working on this game called Balan Wonderworld, and people got hyped because it was the creator of Sonic the Hedgehog working with the publisher of Final Fantasy. But there was some conflict. Yuji Naka saw there were some bugs in the game that he wanted to address, and Square Enix was like, nah, let's just get it published. So he left over that, and it seemed like, an unfortunate situation. Now, what happens is in 2020, they publish this game, and they use his name to try to sell it. They market it with his name, like from the creator of Sonic the Hedgehog. So when the game comes out and the reviews aren't favorable, Yuji Naka gets a lot of blame. Some people say, oh, he's stuck in the 90s, the way he designs things. So, yeah, I'd be irritated too if they used me as a scapegoat. So he's taking him to court. I don't know the specifics, but it feels unfortunate because in 2006 he left Sega to form his own company. They did some projects and he eventually left them to work with Square Enix. And now that said company is basically just him. I think he published one mobile game I don't know the name of. But anyway, it feels like a far cry from what he used to do. And honestly, I don't know why he doesn't work somewhere else. There are other companies that would value his talent. Who knows? Maybe he just doesn't like the structures of working for a game company and just wants to do his own thing. That's not the worst thing ever. I mean, Masahiro Sakurai, he left Nintendo famously, although he wound up working on like all the Smash Bros. Game. So it's kind of like, and I don't know if it's like Yuji Naka is like in the doldrums, like he's just scraping by, but it doesn't sound like the former glory that he used to enjoy from way back in the day. But, he's proven himself with the games he's designed. I mean, Sonic is still played 30 years later, although it's got a pretty interesting fan base, let's just say that. But if you know Sonic, then its fan base can be kind of anyway. So what's up next? Yeah. Well, I hope he finds a place he can work at so he can make his art, but also, do what he needs to live. What else is next? Oh, speaking of the PlayStation, I promise that this podcast isn't just going to be me talking about video games, but right now at 8 in the morning, this is what I can think of. So anyway, one of my favorite games from way back in the day is this PlayStation 1 RPG called Jade Cocoon. Now, if you remember back in the day, there were a lot of Pokemon knockoffs, and some people hated them, some people loved them, some were neutral. For me, I kind of loved Pokemon knockoffs because I wanted to play more Pokemon games, but they didn't come up with enough. So if something close to that came out, I'd be like, okay, cool. Also, I think I was just intrigued by how they would basically take the concept of capturing monsters and make it different. Some were more successful than others, but for the most part, if I got one, I enjoyed it. But then again, I had a habit of enjoying the games that other people didn't necessarily show enough love. And I think one of those games was Jade Cocoon. One of the things that caught my attention was the art style. I think when I discovered the game, it had been maybe like a year or so after I had seen Princess Mononoke, which I'd never seen anything like that up until that point. I know people use that description sort of like, people will say, oh, you've never seen anything like it. But that was one of those few movies where I feel like I legit had never seen anything like it before. So a game with that art style intrigued me. I mean, I could tell that it was supposed to be like Pokemon and that you capture monsters, but I felt it was darker and more mature. So again, the differences always intrigued me, and I wanted to see their take on the concept. So one of the interesting things about this game is that it was developed by a company called Genki, which means energy in Japanese, and they were known mostly for making racing games. So you have a company making something that is out of their element, like not the norm of what they usually do. Now, one of the things I noticed is this game is gorgeous. Like, I got that from the screenshots in the video game guide. That was the funny thing. There was a guide for the game, which I looked at so much before I ever actually bought the game. And I didn't get the game until one day me and my grandpa were at like the military PX store, and we were in the electronics section, and I saw the game like in the window. I'm like, and something in me figured like I didn't do this as a kid where I'm like, can we get this? Can we get this? Can we get this? But something compelled me to ask my grandpa, hey, can we get this game? And he was like, okay. So I got it, and one of the things that surprised me was I finished it that weekend. It was a very short game. It was maybe 3 days of intense grinding, and I finished it. So that was a bit of a But I enjoyed it. So one of the things I noticed about it is the backgrounds are gorgeous. Now, this was a PlayStation 1 game, so the graphics were limited, but again, the backgrounds were gorgeous. The one caveat is it's not like a modern day RPG where you move around and the background moves around with you. The backgrounds were pre-rendered. Um, for those of you who are having a hard time, look up the very first Resident Evil video game. The characters were 3D and you could move around in 3 directions, but they had to use pre-rendered backgrounds because the game had its limitations, or the PlayStation had its limitations. I don't think it was until the PS2 that the whole pre-rendered background thing disappeared. Anyway, and you could tell that a lot of love was put into this game, from like the artwork to the music, just everything. Now, it does have this lore behind it, which there are some plot holes, or I wouldn't say plot holes. Basically, the game is kind of like, it's funny. Let's see, how do I describe it? So I feel like, so Japan is known for not being a particularly religious country, but it's funny, this game almost feels like, if they took the creation story from the Bible, but, made through the lens of Japanese sensibilities. So in this game, there's this, deity named Elrum, and he makes the spirits, and they go throughout the world, and they populate it with their creations. And one day, one spirit makes a creature called the Beast of Knowledge, aka humans. And so Elrum says, don't associate with it, it'll lead to your downfall. And the spirits are like, okay. But then one day, one of the spirits is like, that Beast of Knowledge is pretty attractive. And Elrum is like, no. Alright. So he takes the child of that union of the spirit and the Beast of Knowledge, and, he locks it away, because it'll be too powerful or something like that. So I think it's very interesting that in this situation that people are almost like sort of the role that the serpent plays in the Genesis story, and that it isn't, in this story, it isn't God that makes people. It's, for all intents and purposes, angels. It's an interesting cultural commentary on Japan that's how things go. You could probably do a whole podcast on that. Anyway, so one of the things I love about this, so there's this rich lore to the game, and sometimes they mention things that don't necessarily play out in the game mechanics, but it's one of those things that I could forgive. One of the things that's great about it is you can breed monsters. Like, you can take two and create an offspring, and then it kind of has features of both creatures. And depending on which characters you mix together, you can get a pretty powerful mixture. Now, there's some boss monsters that no matter how much breeding you do, you're never going to get that creature, which is a bit disappointing. But that was probably more having to do with the limits of the PlayStation, like the first one, the one whose architecture was developed back in 1992, and the system was published, I think the PlayStation 1 was published from 94 to sometime in the mid-2000s. Anyway, if there was ever a game that was going to get a remake, I feel like Jade Cocoon would be so great. Not just and for the opposite reasons that more established properties get remade. Like, it makes sense why PlayStation would get or not PlayStation, blah. I guess the caffeine hasn't quite hit me yet. It makes sense why Final Fantasy VII gets a remake, because there's this great story, and the graphics of the time limited that story. And I think there's a similar case with Jade Cocoon, but the difference is there was a vision that really was hampered by the technological limitations. And it almost feels like the game should have been made for nowadays. But if it weren't for the Pokemon craze of the time that it was published, it might not have been made or conceptualized. So there's that. Anyway, it feels like it would benefit so much from the technology that makes an open world game like Breath of the Wild possible. And I don't know, I feel like the game deserves to be enjoyed by more people than it was. So, but anyway. So I mentioned how the PlayStation was maintained or published into the, I think, mid 2000s. Nintendo, they did something similar with the NES of all things, or the Famicom as it's known in Japan. The Famicom was published, or was first put out in 1983. The US wouldn't get one until 1985, and due to the video game crash, we really wouldn't. They had to fight for retailers to even carry it, but it proved successful, and we got to enjoy it just as much as Japan did. So anyway, so they stopped selling systems in, I think, up until the late 90s, and they stopped offering technical support for the Famicom slash NES in 2003, which is like 20 years after. So that says something to the commitment to their customers. Also, on top of that, there were the first batch of Famicoms in Japan. They had this glitch or flaw that really hampered the experience, and Hiroshi Yamauchi decided, we messed up, let's give them new systems. And some people are like, that's financial suicide, but it ingratiated Nintendo so much to its fan base that it really established this loyalty with them. It gave them the sense that Nintendo actually cared. So anyway, yeah. I think there's a real difference between Nintendo and Sega. I really feel like Sega's biggest problem was Hayao Nakayama. The dude seemed to really want to just crank stuff out. And I guess that was a philosophy he had adapted before Sega got into video games, when their arcade machines were more mechanical based. But as soon as video games enter the fray and you have to work with digital stuff, which is dependent on, technological advances, the sort of one-upsmanship and like just trying to stay ahead of the competition, that can potentially work against you. Like, it's funny, he had one good thing in that he hired Tom Kalinske for Sega of North America, and Tom Kalinske made a lot of great decisions that really helped them to succeed. He made Sonic the Hedgehog the pack-in title with the Sega Genesis, and for the first time, Nintendo had a serious competitor in North America. Although it wasn't until the Sega Saturn that they had a real hit in their own home country. So Hayao Nakayama did that right. And then everything else was like blah. Sony and Sega almost worked on what would become the PlayStation. They were like, hey, let's team up together to take on Nintendo. They slighted us, and yeah, you guys know how to make video games. And Sega of North America were like, yeah, this sounds good. But in Japan, Sega of Japan was like, nope, we want to do our stuff. So, I mean, that sucked for them. They could have had the PlayStation, basically. And also, I feel like I'm not saying anything new to people who know about this subject matter. But, man, it just feels like they really wanted money. And they started to communicate to their fans, like, that's what we want. We don't care about you. So what happens is, it's a couple years away from the 3D generation of systems. But Hayao Nakayama's like, I want to jump ahead of the competition. We gotta offer them something. So they come up with something called the 32X, which was a way to boost the Genesis into a 32-bit system. That way people would have something to play until the Saturn came out. Meanwhile, Tom Kalinske, who we've mentioned before, he's like, the Genesis is selling so well, do we really need to do this? But Hayao Nakayama overruled him. Tom Kalinske wound up leaving Sega. So anyway, that happens, and the thing is, third-party developers did not have enough time to meet the deadline for the 32X's launch. So people who bought it just didn't have enough games. And the 32X was only going to be out for about a year before the Saturn happened. And I think to add insult to injury, they wound up releasing the Saturn way earlier by like several months. And it even damaged their relationship with some retailers in the US. So the Saturn was a huge success in Japan, oddly enough, because Sega wasn't totally convinced with 3D graphics. So the funny thing that they did was they made the Sega Saturn sort of this half 3D, half 2D engine. It could do 3D comparative to, say, the PlayStation and N64, but it really did 2D graphics, like, outstanding. Like, comparable to, say, video games in arcades at the time that were still doing 2D. It really wasn't until they saw how good Virtua Fighter was that they're like, okay, let's give 3D more of a chance. But this made it really difficult for third-party developers to make games for the system. So it didn't take too long before they realized, okay, we made a mistake, and they began development on the Dreamcast. I forget which point Hayao Nakayama left Sega, but I think, he realized, maybe I'm not the best guy, or people were just like, get out of here. Anyway, he leaves, and you'd think, okay, things are going to be better now, but it's really funny how one guy can have such a bad influence on a company that his habit of bad decisions persist. It just seems that, they'd grown so accustomed to poor decision making that that's all they could do. And the Dreamcast wound up being Sega's last console system, which is a shame. And I think one of the reasons why is because, well, one of the things that made them so successful was they were the first company that targeted an older demographic. And so that's something that Nintendo was hesitant to do. they were the family-friendly company, although they did have mature titles. But Sega sort of catered to that. Then along comes the PlayStation, and they do that as well. But they understand also, quality control. They understand you've got to make good games in order to sell. And PlayStation, one of the genius moves that they did was they sold their hardware at a loss, but they knew they were going to make that back with the games they sold. So jump to the Dreamcast, and the Xbox is like coming out around then. So both Xbox and the PlayStation are like, we're the game system for mature players. And Sega is still hanging on to that. The thing is, all they offer is games. They don't really offer anything else on their system. Now, this isn't a big deal because Nintendo took the same route, but they were still the family-friendly system. Now, one of the things that led to Sega's downfall with the Dreamcast is the fact that the older demographic didn't want to just play games. They also wanted to watch DVDs and have online features. Which even the GameCube, it did have those features. So, yeah. It's no wonder that Sega wound up deciding to pull out. Because the Sega Dreamcast did do well initially, but then there was a chip shortage, and it was very easy to pirate their games. They had no protection system whatsoever to speak of. So there's sort of the ideal system if you're doing homebrew development for. There's not much you have to work around. Anyway, that was the fall of Sega, and they really haven't recovered from it. They're now a software developer, but, it's a far cry from what they used to be. Excuse me. I think one thing that surprised me is that Atari, of all entities, has tried to make a comeback with the system. I think it was early in the pandemic that they released something called the Atari VCS, which is a throwback to one of their older systems. Now, you might think, oh, it's a system. Well, yes, but it's more like a high-powered PC that can play video games. Nothing comparable to even, say, the PS4 and Xbox. But, yeah. The one thing I think they're hoping for is it's very easy to develop a game for. So that intrigued me enough to where I kind of contemplated getting one. But at the time, I don't know enough about making video games to actually make one. Maybe if I was more technically minded, I would. And one of the things that I never thought I would ever contemplate getting an Xbox, just because, I don't know, they never appealed to me. But I do hear that they have a developers mode on their system, so that was intriguing. It's a shame that Nintendo and Sony don't have that option as well. I think that PlayStation, they have a video game called Dreams, which is basically a game where you can use the game to make all kinds of art, from music to graphics to movies, and I've seen some pretty impressive stuff. I think with that game, the interface is so easy and intuitive that you can create something really impressive. That was one of the things that made me briefly think about getting a PS4, but I don't have the time or the money to try and do that. So, one last commentary, and then I'll wrap up this inaugural episode. So I remember when, Power Rangers first came out. Like any kid at that time, I loved it. And as time progressed, not as much. That was probably just me growing out of it. Anyway, one of the things that I thought was funny was for the first 3 seasons they had the same outfits, but then like their Zords kept changing. I'm like, why? I didn't realize at the time that what was happening was in Japan they change everything every year. There's like a new team, a new theme, a new motif. Now the Americans realized, okay, we can't change everything just yet. So for the first 3 seasons, they used the same outfits and the same characters, but they would change the robots, the Zords. Um, they basically embraced the yearly tradition with Power Rangers Zeo, and they did this all the way ever since. But after Power Rangers Operation Overdrive, um, Power Rangers was owned by Disney at the time, and they said, "Yeah, we're not doing any more of this." And I remember thinking, like, shoot, this is the end of an era. I thought Power Rangers was like legit done. But then I found out I found out Saban regained the rights to Power Rangers and teamed up with Nickelodeon. And so they started readapting every season, but then they sort of started to add extra stuff that wasn't in the Japanese thing. Um, and I'm like, huh, okay, better than nothing. So anyway, fast forward a couple years, and Hasbro buys the rights to Power Rangers. Now, one of the things that Hasbro does is like, we're not gonna adapt every season. They say, if it makes sense, like to sell toys, if we think this season is prime fodder for selling toys, we'll adapt it. But if not, then we'll skip it. And from a business perspective, I mean, they are a toy company. That's a fair point. But from like a fan perspective, it's like, man, that kind of sucks. But it is what it is. And I feel like most of the people who grew up with Power Rangers back in the day, they've gravitated more towards the Super Sentai TV shows from Japan, which surprisingly are now available to buy. I think there's a company called Shout Factory. Um, they put them out on DVD. I don't know if they do Blu-ray. They even have an online streaming service you can watch for free. And by free, I mean there's ads. They don't have an app and the viewing it on your phone on the web browser is like almost non-existent. I try to. It's really just better to like buy the DVD set anyway. So that concludes the first episode of the David Wells Experiment. I've tried recording this a couple times. Maybe I'll release those demos sometime in the future. Hope you liked it, and we'll see you again. See ya.